Continue to Part 2. Anne's wedding day had been the beginning of a chapter she once thought impossible, and though the vows she and Marcus exchanged seemed to seal their destiny in golden light, life after the ceremony unfolded with challenges that tested the very strength of the love that had carried them so far. In the weeks that followed, whispers still traveled through the halls of Marcus's family estate, voices laced with disapproval from relatives who could not understand why a man of privilege and influence would choose a woman who once had nothing, a woman whose past was marked by nights of hiding, by days of hunger, by the kind of rejection that leaves scars deeper than the eye can see. But Marcus, unwavering, always reminded, and that what they had was stronger than disapproval. And every time he held her hand in public, every time he stood tall beside her at family gatherings, he silently declared that love was not a transaction and loyalty could not be bought with wealth or titles. Still, and often lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, asking herself whether she was strong enough to keep fighting this silent battle, because while the smile she wore during the day was bright enough to calm Marcus's worries, the weight of knowing she was the outsider in a world she had never belonged to sometimes made her chest ache. Yet in those quiet hours, when Marcus would stir in his sleep and instinctively pull her close, she would remember the journey she had walked, how she had survived rejection, how she had outrun danger, how she had endured loneliness, and she reminded herself that every dawn after a storm had been proof that her story was not one of defeat, but of perseverance. Still, the struggle was far from over, because not all battles are fought with swords. Many are fought with glances, with silence, with the sting of words unspoken yet loudly felt. And so, at dinners where Marcus's relatives praised other women of better standing, Anne would sit with her back straight, her smile unwavering, her dignity intact, knowing that her worth was not defined by their approval, but by the life she was building with the man who had chosen her. And it was in those moments of quiet resistance that Anne discovered another layer of strength within herself, a strength that grew stronger each time she chose grace over bitterness, patience over anger, love over resentment. And Marcus, though burdened by the strain of divided loyalties, found himself falling even deeper in love with her resilience, because in Anne he saw not only a wife, but a warrior cloaked in gentleness, a woman whose presence reminded him daily of the values he had vowed to uphold. As the months turned to years, their marriage became both sanctuary and battlefield, a space where joy and trials lived side by side. Yet what held them together was not the absence of conflict, but the determination to face it hand in hand, for Marcus's work often demanded long hours and constant travel, leaving and to navigate many challenges alone. But instead of succumbing to loneliness, she poured herself into building something meaningful. She started a small foundation for young women who, like her, had once felt voiceless, offering them not just material support, but also hope, teaching them that their past did not define their future. And through that work Anne began to see that her pain had not been wasted, that every rejection she had once endured had prepared her to become a beacon for others. And though some of Marcus's relatives continued to whisper, their voices grew fainter against the chorus of gratitude from the countless lives untouched, because when a woman who has walked through the fire reaches out her hand, she carries with her an authority no wealth or title can rival. Still, life was not without storms, and one of the greatest came when Marcus's family business faced collapse, a crisis that threatened not only their financial stability, but also the fragile respect Marcus had earned from his relatives, many of whom turned against him in anger, blaming Anne for being a distraction, claiming that had he chosen differently, he would not have made sentimental decisions, and the pressure was enough to crack the spirit of any man. Yet Marcus, instead of yielding to bitterness, found solace in Anne's unwavering presence, because while others doubted him, she believed, while others accused, she encouraged, and while others abandoned him, she stood firm, reminding him daily that failure was not the end but the soil from which resilience grows. And so together they weathered that storm, learning that true wealth is not in accounts or estates, but in the unbreakable bond between two hearts that refuse to let go. And when finally, Through persistence and integrity, Marcus rebuilt what had been lost, not only restoring but reimagining his work. Those who had doubted were left speechless, for they saw with their own eyes that love, rooted in loyalty, was more enduring than any legacy built on status alone. And as Anne and Marcus grew older together, their story became less about the rejection they once endured and more about the lives they touched, because their marriage, though imperfect, had become a living testimony that love is not a fairy tale meant to escape reality, but a journey meant to transform it, a fire that refines rather than consumes. And though Anne often laughed at the irony of being once seen as unworthy, she never forgot the night Marcus lifted her veil and whispered those words, "You're my forever." For in them she had found not only a husband but a companion for every dawn after darkness, every battle after rejection, every dream after despair. And together they proved to the world, and more importantly to themselves, that when two souls choose loyalty over status, courage over fear, and faith over doubt, not even the fiercest storm can extinguish the light they carry, a light that continues to shine, inspiring everyone who dares to believe that resilience, love, and faith are stronger than rejection, wealth, or status. And as the years unfolded like pages in a book neither Anne nor Marcus could have written on their own, new chapters came with fresh trials and blessings that shaped them in ways they never imagined. For not long after the business crisis had been steadied, Anne discovered she was expecting their first child, a revelation that filled her with equal parts joy and fear. Because though she longed to be a mother, the echoes of her own painful past whispered doubts into her heart. Would she know how to love a child when she herself had once been abandoned? Could she offer stability when her early life had been defined by running and rejection? But Marcus silenced her fears with steady words and gentle assurance, reminding her that love was not inherited by bloodlines but chosen daily. And when their daughter was born, tiny and fragile yet full of life, Anne felt a part of her heart heal in ways she had never thought possible, for holding that child was like holding redemption, proof that broken beginnings could still lead to beautiful legacies. Yet even in the joy of new life, challenges arose, because whispers resurfaced, some saying that Marcus's daughter would be better off if raised away from Anne's influence, others predicting that the marriage would not withstand the pressures of parenthood. But once again, Anne chose grace, pouring her love into motherhood with such devotion that even the harshest critic could not deny the bond between mother and child. And as the little girl grew, so did Anne's foundation, expanding from a small community project into a recognized movement that gave young women across the country access to education, mentorship, and hope, with Anne often standing on stages she once could not have imagined, sharing her story not to glorify herself, but to remind others that resilience is a seed that can bloom even in the most barren soil. Marcus, though consumed with responsibilities of rebuilding and leading his ventures, never failed to stand beside her, sometimes quietly in the audience, sometimes proudly introducing her as not just his wife, but as a force of change. And through these seasons, they both discovered that their love was not meant to shelter them from the world, but to anchor them as they faced it, though life still tested that anchor. For as their daughter grew, so did the pressures of raising a child in a world quick to judge and slow to forgive. And there were days when Anne found herself defending not only her own worth, but also her daughter's right to walk proudly in both her parents' legacies. And on such days Marcus would take her hand, look her in the eyes, and remind her that the only approval that mattered was the one they found in each other and in the God who had carried them so far. Still, storms did not end there, for tragedy struck when Anne's health was suddenly threatened by an illness that forced her to slow down, confining her to hospital rooms and long nights of uncertainty. And though the woman who had once been a warrior for so many now felt helpless and weak, Marcus refused to leave her side, canceling meetings, ignoring whispers, choosing instead to sit beside her, holding her hand through every painful treatment, whispering the same words he had spoken on their wedding day. "You're my forever." And in those moments Anne realized that love is not proven in grand gestures, but in quiet, steady presence when the world falls apart. and as her health gradually returned, their bond deepened, becoming less about surviving rejection and more about cherishing every ordinary day they were given. Their daughter, now old enough to understand, watched all this and carried into her own young heart the lesson that true strength is found not in wealth or power, but in loyalty, courage, and love. And as the years stretched onward, and in Marcus's story became one told not only at family gatherings, but in classrooms, in villages, in conferences, where people spoke of them not as a couple untouched by hardship, but as two souls who had embraced hardship and transformed it into testimony. And though critics still existed, their voices grew faint against the symphony of hope and in Marcus created with their lives, for their marriage was no longer simply about two people choosing each other. It had become about building a legacy of faith, resilience, and compassion that reached far beyond themselves. A legacy that proved once and for all that love, when rooted in integrity and watered with courage, could indeed withstand rejection, overcome despair, and illuminate even the darkest night with a dawn brighter than anyone thought possible. Yes, and in Marcus moved deeper into the seasons of their marriage. Life unfolded like a winding river, sometimes calm and reflective, other times stormy and uncertain, but always carrying them forward into uncharted waters where their love was tested, refined, and strengthened. And while their first years had been marked by battles against rejection and the heavy shadows of family disapproval, the later years began to open into wider landscapes of responsibility, community, and legacy. For as their daughter grew into childhood and then into her teenage years, and found herself learning to balance the roles of wife, mother, leader, and friend, sometimes overwhelmed by the weight of so many hats, but never losing sight of the truth that everything she did was born out of love and resilience. And though Marcus continued to shoulder the demands of business, leadership, and the constant tug of family expectations, he remained grounded in the vow he had made. That end was his forever. And every evening when he returned home, whether weary or triumphant, he greeted her not as the woman the world judged, but as the woman who had captured his heart, and in that steadfastness and found the courage to keep pressing forward even when the journey felt exhausting. Their daughter Lydia grew up surrounded by both whispers of doubt and songs of encouragement, for on one side she heard from some relatives that her mother had once been unworthy, while on the other side she witnessed the countless women who called in a hero, a lifeline, a mentor. And as Lydia matured, she began to wrestle with her own identity, wondering where she fit between the world of privilege her father had been born into and the world of struggle her mother had survived. And there were moments when she rebelled, moments when she questioned why she could not simply live a normal life without being the subject of gossip or scrutiny, and instead of silencing her daughter, chose to walk with her through those questions, telling her stories of nights when she had nothing but faith to survive, showing her that identity is not found in wealth or in the opinions of others, but in the courage to embrace one's story. And though Lydia sometimes rolled her eyes, the truth of those lessons seeped deep into her soul, planting seeds that would one day grow into wisdom. Meanwhile, Anne's foundation expanded beyond anything she had once dreamed, spreading from local efforts to national initiatives, building schools, shelters, and mentorship programs. And though she never sought fame, her story began to draw attention across borders, leading her to speak at international conferences where she reminded audiences that the measure of a society is not in how it treats the privileged, but in how it uplifts the rejected. And through it all, Marcus remained her greatest supporter, often rearranging his schedule just to stand in the audience, clapping louder than anyone else. And their marriage, though not free from conflict, became a picture-off partnership that many admired. Two imperfect people who chose daily to stand together despite the storms that pressed against them. Yet life, as always, had a way of bringing unexpected challenges, and one of the greatest came when Marcus's health began to falter after years of overwork and stress, forcing him to confront his own vulnerability. And for Anne, who had leaned so heavily on his strength, it was a painful reversal to suddenly be the caretaker, to sit by his hospital bed night after night, whispering prayers into the darkness. But just as Marcus had once held her hand through her illness, and now held his, proving that love is not a fair-weather promise, but a covenant that endures through sickness and weakness. And though recovery was slow, those difficult months deepened their bond, reminding them both that the truest wealth was not in titles, achievements, or possessions, but in the quiet, steady presence of each other. As Marcus regained strength, Lydia began to step into her own calling, inspired by her parents' resilience, and she started volunteering at her mother's foundation, discovering that her voice carried power not just because of her parents' influence, but because of her own lived experiences of watching them fight against rejection and build something beautiful out of brokenness. And when she eventually chose to study social work, some family members scoffed, wishing she would pursue business or law. But Marcus and beamed with pride, knowing that their daughter was choosing purpose over status, integrity over applause, and in that choice they saw their legacy continuing. Yet even as Lydia spread her wings, the world continued to throw challenges their way. For political tensions, economic struggles, and social unrest sometimes threatened the very communities Anne's foundation served, forcing her to make difficult decisions about how to allocate limited resources, when to speak, and when to stay silent. But each time she faced criticism or setback, she reminded herself of the little girl she once was, the one who had been rejected, abandoned, and left, to believe she had no future. And she pressed on, knowing that if her younger self could survive despair, then surely her older self could stand firm in the face of criticism. Marcus, for his part, found new meaning in mentoring young leaders, often telling them that success without integrity is nothing more than failure dressed in gold. And together he and became a living testimony to the truth that love and resilience are not abstract ideals, but daily choices made in kitchens and hospital rooms, in board meetings and quiet prayers, in the raising of children and the serving of strangers. As the years stretched into decades, they grew older, their hair touched with silver, their steps slower, but their love no less fierce. And on quiet evenings they would often sit together on the porch of their home, watching the sunset with fingers still intertwined, reflecting on the journey from rejection to acceptance, from despair to hope. And each time Marcus would glance at and whisper, sometimes with the same boyish grin he had worn on their wedding day, "You're my forever." And each time Anne's heart would swell, not because the words were new, but because they had been proven true through every trial, every storm, every tear, and every triumph. And though they knew that one day their earthly journey together would come to an end, they also knew that the story they had written with their lives would continue in the countless people they had touched, the women who had found courage through Anne's foundation, the young leaders shaped by Marcus's mentorship, the daughter who carried their values into the future, and the many who had watched them stand firm against the tide of rejection and choose love again and again. And so, in the end, their story was not just about a wedding aisle or a whispered vow. It was about the unyielding truth that resilience, courage, and faith can turn even the darkest night into a dawn brighter than anyone dared imagine. And that, when two hearts choose loyalty and integrity over money and status, they do more than just build a marriage. They build a legacy that echoes through generations, reminding the world that love, in its purest form, is both the greatest gift and the greatest revolution of all. As the years turned into decades, Anne and Marcus found themselves stepping into the season of wisdom, where the urgency of youth gave way to the gentleness of reflection, and though their bodies slowed and their faces carried the lines of laughter and tears, their spirits seemed only to grow stronger, for they had learned that resilience was not just about surviving storms, but about learning to dance in the rain. And on evenings when the world outside seemed restless, they would sit together on their porch with cups of tea, remembering the days when rejection had nearly broken them, marveling at how the very struggles that once felt unbearable had become the foundation for the life they now enjoyed. And as Lydia blossomed into adulthood, graduating with honors and throwing herself into the work of justice and compassion, and in Marcus could not help but see in her a living reflection of their love, a woman unafraid to speak truth, unafraid to stand against the tide, unafraid to give her life for something bigger than herself. And though she often joked that her parents' shadow was too long for her to ever escape, she carried that shadow with pride, knowing it was not a burden but a covering. Yet life, in its unpredictability, was not done with testing them, for as Lydia prepared to marry a man she loved deeply, a teacher who shared her passion for service, old wounds resurfaced within the extended family, with some still murmuring that history was repeating itself, that Lydia was lowering herself by choosing love over status, and though the whispers stung, and smiled through them, remembering her own walk down the aisle, and she whispered into her daughter's ear the same words she had once told herself. Your worth is not defined by their acceptance, but by the courage to choose love. And on the day Lydia stood at the altar, radiant and unshaken, Marcus and Anne sat in the front row with tears streaming down their cheeks, not of sorrow but of joy, for they knew they were witnessing the continuation of a legacy birthed in pain, but blooming in hope. And after the wedding, when the house grew quieter and the season slowed, Anne and Marcus began to dedicate more of their days to mentoring young couples, reminding them that love is not sustained by fairy tales, but by daily choices, sacrifices, forgiveness, and resilience. And their home, once a battleground of whispers, became a sanctuary for many who sought wisdom, their porch echoing with laughter, prayers, and the unpolished stories of those who needed guidance. Still, time pressed forward, and one winter morning Marcus fell ill once more, this time more severely, his breath shallow, his strength fading, and though doctors did what they could, and knew deep in her soul that the man who had once whispered, "You're my forever," would soon be whispering it from beyond the veil of time, and so she stayed by his side in those final days, holding his hand as she had for decades, speaking softly of their journey, of the aisle, of the storms, of the triumphs, of the legacy they had built. And Marcus, though weak, managed to smile and whispered once more, with all the love his frail voice could carry, "You will always be my forever." And with those words he slipped peacefully into eternity. Grief washed over, and like a tidal wave, for though she had known this day would come, nothing could prepare her for the silence of a house once filled with his laughter. Yet even in her mourning, she clung to the faith that had carried her through every trial, reminding herself that love, when true, never dies. It simply changes form. And so she rose each morning, not with the strength of her youth, but with the quiet determination of a woman who knew her purpose was not finished, and she poured her remaining years into writing, speaking, and walking alongside others who faced rejection, telling them that pain can be the seed of purpose, that despair can birth hope, that rejection can be the soil from which resilience grows. And when finally her own time came, she slipped away not with fear, but with peace, knowing she would be reunited with her forever. And those who gathered to honor her life spoke not just of her foundation, her speeches, or her accomplishments, but of her unshakable love, her fierce resilience, and the way she had transformed rejection into redemption. And as Lydia carried her parents' torch into a new generation, she realized that the truest inheritance they had left her was not wealth or name, but the living testimony that loyalty, courage, and faith can turn even the darkest nights into dawns brighter than anyone imagined. And so Anne and Marcus's story lived on, whispered in classrooms, retold in villages, written in books, sung in hymns, carried in the lives of countless men and women who had been touched by their example, proving for generations to come that true love is not about ease or status, but about the resilience to hold on when everything else says let go, the courage to stand firm when the world rejects you, and the faith to believe that every ending is only the beginning of a dawn no one saw coming, and walked slowly down the aisle, and with every step she remembered how far she had come, from despair to hope, from rejection to acceptance, from running for her life to finally walking toward her destiny. And though her heart pounded with nervous anticipation, each stride felt like a victory march, a declaration that her past no longer defined her. And when Marcus gently lifted her veil and whispered, "You're my forever," her eyes filled with tears, for in that moment she realized this was not just her fairy tale come true. It was living proof that resilience, courage, and faith could transform even the darkest night into a dawn no one ever expected. But the wedding was only the beginning, for life after the ceremony was not wrapped in the neat ribbons of a storybook ending, but woven instead with both challenges and triumphs that would test the very strength of their vows. Because whispers soon followed them from the corners of Marcus's family estate, whispers laced with disapproval from relatives who could not understand why a man of wealth and influence would choose a woman once marked by poverty, hardship, and scars of rejection. And though Marcus stood tall beside and, holding her hand with unyielding loyalty, she sometimes lay awake at night wondering if she was strong enough to endure being an outsider in a world she had never belonged to. Yet when Marcus stirred in his sleep and instinctively pulled her close, she remembered that she had once survived hunger, abandonment, and danger, and she reminded herself that her story had never been about defeat, but about perseverance. Still, battles were fought not always with swords, but with glances, silences, and cutting remarks, and at dinners where others praised women of better standing, and sat with her back straight, her dignity unshaken, her smile unwavering, choosing grace over bitterness, patience over anger, and love over resentment. And Marcus, though burdened by divided loyalties, loved her all the more for her quiet strength, seeing in her not only a wife, but a warrior cloaked in gentleness. Their marriage became both sanctuary and battlefield, joy and trials living side by side. Yet what held them together was not the absence of conflict, but the determination to face it hand in hand. And while Marcus's long work hours often left and navigating challenges alone, she poured herself into building something meaningful, founding a small initiative for young women who, like her, had once felt voiceless. And in that work she discovered that her pain had not been wasted, that every rejection she had endured had prepared her to become a beacon of hope. And as the foundation grew, so did the gratitude of countless lives she touched, until the voices of relatives who had doubted her grew faint against the chorus of women who called her mentor, sister, and friend. But storms returned when Marcus's family business teetered on collapse, threatening not only their financial stability, but also his fragile respect among relatives, many of whom turned their anger on and, calling her a distraction, blaming her for sentimental choices. Yet while others doubted Marcus and encouraged him, while others accused, she defended, and while others abandoned, she stayed, whispering daily that failure was not the end but the soil of resilience. And together they weathered that storm, rebuilding not only the business but reimagining it with integrity, proving that loyalty and courage were wealth greater than any estate. Time passed and joy bloomed when and discovered she was expecting their first child, though joy was mingled with fear, for she wondered if a woman once abandoned could ever know how to mother. But Marcus calmed her with gentle words, reminding her that love is not inherited but chosen. And when their daughter Lydia was born, fragile and radiant, and felt a deep wound inside her heal, for in her arms lay redemption itself, proof that broken beginnings could still lead to beautiful legacies. Yet raising Lydia brought new challenges, as whispers resurfaced, some insisting the child would be better raised away from Anne's influence. But Anne poured herself into motherhood with devotion, proving every critic wrong as her daughter grew surrounded not only by privilege, but also by the lessons of resilience, hope, and faith. And as Lydia grew, so too did Anne's foundation, expanding from a local shelter into schools, mentorships, and programs that drew international recognition, placing it on stages she once thought unreachable. telling crowds that the measure of society is not how it treats the privileged, but how it uplifts the rejected. And Marcus, proud beyond words, often sat in the front row clapping louder than anyone else, knowing her voice carried the strength of survival. Still, storms do not cease with age, and tragedy struck when Anne's health failed, confining her to hospital rooms, where she sometimes felt helpless. Yet Marcus, who once had leaned on her strength, now became her rock, canceling meetings, ignoring whispers, choosing instead to sit beside her bed,